Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're talking about Penpot. This is the world's easiest Penpot crash course. So to get started, just click the link in the description to reach the Penpot website, which is penpot.app. Now that we are inside of the Penpot site, let's get started. The first thing you're going to do is sign up now. Just to open up the actual Penpot application, I'm just going to accept the cookies and you're going to sign up from over here. Now that we've signed up, we're going to enter all of our information, agree to the terms of service and privacy policy, and create an account. You just have to enter your name, and now you can enter what you'll be using Penpot for, whether it's personal use, educational use, or work use. Let's just do personal use today just to see what Penpot does and to test it out as a product. So I'm just going to start with just exploring, because we are just exploring what Penpot is at the moment, and then you can click on next, and of course it asks you which tools do you use the most, and in my case I use Figma the most. And then we're going to go over to the next screen. What kind of work do you do? We're doing UI UX design, and you're just going to fill out all of these details. Let's just do a freelancer for this version and do I'm working on a personal project, and then go over to the next. So the fourth screen of the onboarding lets you choose where you would like to get started, and so we're just going to design the UI UX of an app. So let's just get started from there. Alright, now this is the actual Penpot application. To get started, you're going to go over here and click on plus to create a new file. And this is the complete Penpot application. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to get started, and all of these tools are very similar to Figma. We have a frame tool right over here. We're going to create a very simple frame, and this is going to be our first board or frame. You can see the rulers over here. The next thing we're going to do is make sure the size of our frame in itself is 1920 by 1080 pixels, which is honestly the standard for any of these desktop UIs. Alright, and now that we have this ready, let's talk about all of the different tools inside of Penpot. So I want to get started with everything that's over at the top. This is the cursor which we're using currently. This is the frame tool, or the board tool, which we just used to create a board. If you're familiar with Figma, the frame of Figma is the board of Penpot. The next thing that I want to talk about is this rectangle tool, which is like the simplest thing you can do. So with this, we've created a very simple rectangle. And of course, I want to talk about some of the properties over here. So you can align this, whether you'd want this to be in the horizontal center, left, right, top, bottom, wherever it is you'd want your shape to stay. You can also change its location through these numbers, through the XY axes, the width and height, the angle of it can be changed, and also the border radius can also be changed. So I'm just going to increase this to 20, and that'll give us this nice rounded off image. You can also open this up and choose individual border radiuses. So this is going to change the individual border radius. So for example, if I wanted to make one side more rounded than each other, then we'd have to use that tool. Alright, with that done, I'm just going to bring this down to 0 because we don't need it right now. We also have the layout section and the constraints section. Both of these are essentially very similar to Figma. So you can create auto layouts and such from over here. In the case of Penpot, you don't exactly have auto layouts. You have flex layouts and grid layouts, which you are more familiar with if you are already doing front-end development work. So I'm just going to talk about the flex and grid layouts for just a moment. So now, for example, I've added a bunch of rectangles. Let's just assume I have a bunch of rectangles that I need to place somewhere. I'm going to select all of them, and I'm going to add an auto layout. So the flex layout is a fancy way of saying you're going to make a layout where everything is in a single line. This line could go from right to left, this could go from left to right, and both of those can be chosen from over here. It can also go from top to bottom, or it can go from bottom to top, and both of those are also allowed. You can also choose the amount of spacing between each of these elements. So if we choose 30, then 30 pixels is going to be the spacing between these. The point is, with flex layouts, they only go in one direction. Whether they're going from top to bottom or they're going from left to right, it's only going to be in one direction. But if, for example, I have another couple of rectangles, let's just Control-C, Control-V them, and Control-C, Control-V also works over here, which is a good thing to know. So now we have a bunch of, let's Control-paste them, Control-C, Control-V and paste them, and now, for example, we have a bunch of squares which we want to place in a perfect grid. So for example, if they weren't aligned properly, we could select them all, add a layout, and this time we'd use grid layouts. Grid layouts will align whatever you're doing in the place of a grid. So now it's two-dimensional. It has a width and it has a height, which is not the case with flex layouts, which only go in one single direction. You can also change which direction your grids are going to stay in. So you can have them go from left to right. You can also have them go from top to bottom. You can choose how they're justified and aligned inside of the grid, and this would become more easier if there was text or other such elements inside of the grid. You can change the size of the grid itself, and that will drag the space of the grid itself. You can make the grid board aligned perfectly, and with that, we've talked about the flex layouts and the grid layouts inside of Penpot. Alright, now that we're done with that, I also want to talk about a couple of other elements. So we also have the constraints over here for the rectangle, which we were talking about previously. We can align or constrain this element to the top and left sides of its main board, but we can also align it to the left and right, or the top and bottom, or we can remove any of these constraints. And what this does is, when you change the size of the board, and I feel like this is when it will become relevant, when you change the size of the board, this element sticks to one direction. So if it's aligned to the top and left, and now when you change the size of the board, no matter what you do, it's always going to retain its position with relation to the top and left. So if the top and left changed in terms of the number, this would still have the same exact spacing as it did before. But if we go over to the constraints and align it to the bottom and right, now when you change the size, the spacing between the bottom and the spacing between the right is going to be what always remains constant. So this is now shrinking away. The top and left spacings are not maintained. The only thing that is guaranteed to be maintained is the the right and bottom spacings. Alright, and this is now our board. There are a couple of other elements. For example, the fill. This fill is the color that we're using over here, so you can change the color of your square itself. I feel like we could just go with any normal shade of blue and that'll be fine. You can also choose a color from the circular color picker. For some people this makes a lot of sense. I feel like this is very easy to use, and it also gives you a really good idea of the color wheel, so you can use complementary colors, primary, secondary colors, and this is really easy when you're making your own color palettes. And it also finally gives you HSVA values, which you can also use to change what color the rectangle has. So this is basically the hue, which is which color the rectangle has. This is saturation, which is the brightness or the darkness, and this is the luminosity, which is whether it's going to be pure black or whether it's going to be white in terms of the amount of light it has. And this is the alpha value, which is basically the transparency. So you can make this less or more transparent with the A or alpha value. Alright, and you can choose any hue you want over here. With that done, we're also going to talk about the gradient and the image fills. So you can also choose a gradient which can go from top to bottom, and you can obviously experiment around with these as much as you want. It can change its directions by rotating. You can also swap the positions of the colors. You can change these individual colors, and this is exactly the same as the way we use this in Figma. If you're not familiar with Figma, we have the complete Figma crash course right up here in the top cards. You can also change the opacity or alpha value over here, and this gives us the really nice ability to make as bright or as deep gradients as we want. The recent colors are also stored over here. You can also have your recent colors in a very nice palette available for quick accessibility, or you can turn it off as soon as you want to. Alright, this is the gradient fill. One final fill that I want to talk about in Penpot is the image fill, and you can choose any image you want to place over here. So I'm just going to choose an image from my device, and I'm just searching for any image to place right now, and then we're going to take that image and create a whole entire UI from there. Alright, so we have this air freshener rose image that is available to us, and we're going to sort of work with that. The reason this is looking really blurry right now is because the opacity is really light, and the way we're going to change that is we're going to go over here to this number and we're going to change it to a complete 100%, and now our whole image is entirely visible. With that done, I also want to talk about the fact that you can add a stroke over here, and this can be inside, center, or outside, is where you're going to start to see the actual thickness and magic of the stroke. 17 pixels is the amount of thickness that will give in this stroke. You can also change the color of the stroke to any shade that you want, and the stroke can be inside of the image's borders in the center, which means 50% on the border, 50% out of the border, and you can also have the stroke be on the outsides completely. This stroke can be solid, it can be dotted with dots, this stroke can also be dashed, and it can also be mixed through a variation of dots and dashes. I'm just going to choose solid for now. And the really nice thing to think about over here is when you add a border radius along with a stroke, the radius curves the stroke as well, which is a really nice UI design tool if you want to use it as that. Alright, I'm going to get rid of the stroke now because I don't really need it. I'm also going to get rid of the border radius because it is not relevant. We're also going to add a shadow just to see what shadows do. So you can have a drop shadow or an inner shadow over here. You can add a little bit of spacing on the x-axis. So this is 40 pixels on the x-axis side for this shadow itself. And then you can also let's do 40 pixels on the y-axis side. So this is coming down now. You can change the percentage of opacity. So for example, if we changed it to 90, now this would be much much darker. And if we change the color, now we wouldn't have a black shadow, we could also have a pink shadow if we wanted to. Your spread can also be changed. So for example, if we do a 30 spread, it's going to spread it out by 30 more pixels than what we originally wanted it to be. And you can also change the blur value, which is going to make it without any blur. So if we change it to 0, then it's going to be a plain solid shape. But if we choose to add a blur of, let's do 36, now this is much blurrier, and there's a 36 pixel blur applied to every single place that this drop shadow is present at. The inner shadow does exactly the opposite. So the stuff that it was doing outside of this image is now done on the inside of this image, hence the name inner shadow. We're going to get rid of this, and we're also going to talk about the last export button. So for example, if this is the image that I'm working with and I added a stroke, and then maybe I added a couple of filters or something, and then I wanted to export this image, now I can just go over here, choose the format that I want to export my image in, PNG, JPG, which are all types of images. And you can also have WebP, which is a modern form of images, and SVG, which are scalable vector graphics, or scalable images, which are basically written in math or vectors, which makes them not pixelate at any size. So they're infinitely scalable, and that has more of an effective value when you're doing illustrations, but we're not going to get into that right now. You can also do PDFs, which is printable document format, or something that you can take to a printer and print, but we're just going to stick with PNGs for now. You can change the size. So the original size of this might be 916 pixels by 889 pixels, but when you do 1x or 2x or 3x, now you're exporting it at 2x the original width and height. So if that makes sense. You can also choose the name of the file, and this is going to go over here in the suffix, and now you can export this element, and this is going to save it inside of my device. And now I'm going to get rid of this because I don't want to export this anymore. Get rid of the stroke because we don't want that either. Now that we have our actual image, let's get started with all of the other elements. So we talked about rectangles and all of its associated properties. Many properties that we talk about now are going to be common, but I do want to talk about them just a little bit, just so we see everything that's available in Penpot. So the next tool that we're talking about is the circle tool. With this, you can create simple circles, or you can press shift and just drag out this beautiful circle. If you press shift, you're not going to end up with these wonky circles. So if you just don't press shift, then you can have a circle that is not a perfect circle. It can be a weird oval or ellipse, but if you press shift and then create a circle, then the width and height is always going to be equal, and you're going to end up with a beautiful looking circle. Alright, let's create a simple circle and talk about all of the different circle properties. Obviously, you have your width and height, your alignment and positioning tools. We talked about layouts, flex and grid layouts also apply in terms of circles. You can also have this circle be constrained to any of these axes. So the top, the right, the left, any of these axes, and the spacing between them and the circle is what we can constrain it to. You can also fix it when you're scrolling, and this will become more clear when we're doing large sites, so more on this later. And now for the fun part, you can change the fill, obviously any shade that you want. You can also change the shadows, the strokes, the blurs, the exports, and all of these are going to be exactly the same as what we saw in terms of the rectangles. So now we're just going to place this over here, right click, and send this to back. And of course, when you right click, you are bombarded with all of these options, but we're going to talk about these options really quickly. And now you're also going to see that we've chosen a color that was already present, that we already chose for the drop shadow, but the opacity for it was only 90%. So Penpot remembered that, and now we're going to change the opacity to be 100%. And now I'm just going to create a copy and paste a bunch of different circles. Let's just add a bunch of circles. Change the color if you have to, just to make it a little bit more fitting with what we're working with over here. You know what? I'm just going to go over here to the eyedropper tool and select the exact same shade of pink. This is where the entire magic of the eyedropper tool comes in. Alright, with that done, I also want to talk about the text tool, which is so awesome. Just press this T, and then you're going to go over here and you're going to type out your text. Let's say the brand name is Velair, so we're just going to type it out, Velair, and I know I've just typed it out in a very small font. And now we can just go over here, zoom in, increase the size, and we're going to talk about all of the other tools later on. Let's increase the size firstly and then talk about all of the text specific tools. So since we've already seen rectangle and circle and all of the tools they offer, most of these tools are the same except for the text tab. All of these tools, layout, constraints, alignment, fill, stroke, shadow, all of these are going to be essentially the same, but the interesting part with text is the text tab. So we're going to talk about a little on what the text tab offers. You can choose any font you want, and this has a huge library of all of the fonts that you can use. Let's search for all of these fonts, and I'm just going to search for outfit because of course it's my favorite font, and then we're going to change the size. You can choose your size from the drop down, but if your size is different, because these are preset very specific numbers, you can obviously customize the size that you want. So it only goes up to 72 pixels in its slider, which is why I'm going to go over and choose 120 because I want to make this even bigger, and you can change this as much as you want. You can also change the font weight of your actual font, and that's going to give you this really nice effect. This is where 400 or the regular font weight lies, and it is a nice reference to have when you're designing things on the fly. You can also change the line height, which is actually useful when you have text in two different lines. So let's say you have text in two different lines, and now when you change the line height to 2, you can now see that there is twice the amount of size that is between a normal line. So this is the line spacing which is between normal lines. So this is line 1, this is line 2, no spacing whatsoever. The standard line height for most scenarios is going to be 1.5, and that's just going to be fine, but in UI design you have to change that sometimes. Alright, you can also change the amount of spacing between each individual letter, and this is also a fun tool that you can have a lot of fun with. You can also go in negative, and that's just going to cram these letters closer than they've ever been, which is a fun thing for you to explore. You can make this title capital, you can change it to title case where the first letter is capital only, or you can change it to small case where everything is small. Of course, you have your left, center, right justified alignments, and you also have the ability to choose whether the text box is going to take exactly the amount of space it needs to, or it can take up all of the extra space that you're allowing it to. And this last button, which is auto height, lets it take the amount of height that it needs to, but the width can go to be as long as it needs to. And then you also have some extra tools which are aligning in terms of vertical height. So if I had this very tall column, this button would allow me to align it perfectly in the middle of that as well. You can underline the text, strike through it, or have this be reading from the left to right side, but for some other languages where there's right to left reading, that is also an option, and this will become easier to understand when the size of the box is bigger and when those languages start to kick in. So I'm just going to change this to left to right for now because English is read from left to right. Alright, now I'm just going to get rid of all of this shenanigans that we've done, and we're just going to type out a very simple name. Don't worry if the weird formatting that's coming up right now. We're just going to get rid of the previous styles. Let's get rid of strike through, and I'm also going to get a really fancy font for us. So I'm just going to try to search for Playfair Display because that is something that you can always rely on. Playfair Display is a super nice, super clean font, and I'm just going to change it to be italic because Playfair Display italics is just another level of class and proficiency. Alright, we're going to make this be title case, and we're going to make this much smaller. Let's just bring the size down to 48, and then we're just going to start working on this entire UI. So I just wanted to get rid of these circles because the entire UI that we're making along with this tutorial doesn't really need circles for this moment. And then let's just talk about the UI that we're building for a little while, and then we can go back to all of the tools. And I promise you this UI is going to give a lot of meaning to the tools that we're going to be talking about from now on. So before I do anything else, I'm just going to change the color of this entire board to a really nice off-white, dull white shade, which sort of matches the internal label, but it gives this a very unified look and feel, and this is a really good starting point. You can also add a title over here, so I just want it to be as classy as possible, which is why we're going to add the title. Alright, now I want to add the name of the brand that this is, and we're going to make that name smaller, as is the case for many luxury websites. Let's make this small, and then we're going to add the name of our actual perfume, which is going to be Rose Mystique. And now we're just going to select this entire chunk of text and make this bigger. So we're just going to have this be at 120. Let this have auto width, which means let it take as much width as it needs to. I feel like all of these individual alphabets have a lot of space between them, and I want to get rid of a little bit of the space. So let's just try to experiment with the spacing of each individual alphabet. Let's try -3. This already looks much better in my opinion, and we're going to make this 140 just to have this be a little bit bigger. The line height can also be adjusted because of course who wouldn't want that? And finally, we're aligning this to the right side. Alright, I feel like we've almost done everything that we need to. I do want to add the colors that we're going to be using for this brand. So of course this brand has its primary colors. I want to get rid of this extra spacing because it's throwing off the alignment that we're working with, and I want to go over here and also try out regular fonts instead of italics every single place. So I feel like we don't have to have italics every single place. Let's just have italics take the center stage with the title, and then leave the font font be as it is. And now I'm just going to change the color of one of these just to give the whole UI a little cleaner look and feel. Alright, and now we have our title. We also have now we have the name of the brand, and then we also have the title over here, and then we're also going to increase the line height. Let's have this be at 1.2. You know what, I'm just trying to go with 1.15, which is fine for this case. And now we're just going to add a little bit of a pricing. Let's have this stay at 1.1 and then leave it at that. And now we're going to have a say in the pricing. One of the most important aspects that I always talk about with luxury brands is you always need to have a lot of empty space or white space or negative space, because that is a huge part of luxury brands and their look and feel. So I do want to get that sorted out. So we're just going to create a simple pricing container, but we're also going to keep a lot of empty white space. Don't be surprised if that happens. Let's add a $sign. Let's add an amount, and now we're just going to make this smaller. Let's just make sure it has auto width, and then we're going to reduce the size back here again. Let's bring this up to 24, but that seems too small, which is weird. Sometimes you do need to take a moment to think about which size will work best. Not the first size is the perfect one, which is completely fine. Alright, let's get rid of the italics, because a clearer pricing section is almost always better. And I also want to reduce the size because visibility will change drastically when you're going from italics to plain fonts, and have that be positioned here where there's a lot of white space already present. So there's nothing at the top, nothing at the bottom, nothing on the left side, and you have a bunch of text, so you want to be very, very careful with the size that you're working with. I don't think it's going to go above 56, but 56 is fine. Alright, let's align this over here, and now we're going to create a very, very simple button. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to create a text box and then add a button that just says buy now. Very, very simple text. Now that we're not using title fonts, we would want to have a lot of normal sized text spacing. So let's just get rid of the -3, and also we're going to create a button. The way we're going to do this is we're going to go over here, add a layout, a flex layout in this case, and then add a little bit of spacing on the horizontal sides, add a little bit of spacing on the vertical sides, and this is our padding basically. We're also going to add a fill at the bottom, and then change this to be black because that's the color we're working with. Change the color of the fill to be white. This already looks so good. We're going to add a little bit of padding, and I feel like we would want to use one sans serif font, because all serif fonts will usually make the results really, really weird. We're going to capitalize this, reduce the font size once again, because sometimes when you're changing the fonts from italics to normal or serif to sans serif to serif, it becomes really difficult to visualize the actual size which will work in your current situation. Oops. And then we're going to select this little board. Board is just a fancy word for frame, which in Penpot, if you're going from Figma to Penpot, this is going to be a little bit confusing, but it does become clearer as you go. Let's align this perfectly over here. And you can press the Alt key to be able to see the amount of space between this and the end. And you can now clearly see everything is perfectly aligned, which is awesome. So just press the Alt key if you're ever in doubts about that. I also do want to have a line that talks about what this product is. Alright, and now I've copied a line of description, and then we're going to get a text box and paste this text inside. Now that we have this text, we're just going to select this entire piece of text, change the color to black, because previously we changed the text color to white, which is sort of what was confusing us now. Let's reduce the font size back to 10. Change this to be title case, because that is a good choice for descriptions. Right align everything, increase the font size a little bit. Let's increase this size to 16. Let's just bring this up to 18, because that would be fine too. Alright, so this is the part where you're talking about a bunch of sizes, and we're just experimenting around to see what works best. A lot of UI design is just getting the sizing and the spacing and all of the little elements to work right for you. Alright, I feel like this is too much. 1.3, 1.2, this works. Alright, let's just align this perfectly over here. And I do think that there is a lot of text over here, and it would be a good idea to break this text down. Let's just select the first group of text, and we're going to get rid of the text that was in the beginning of the sentence. Align this perfectly over here, and then I also want to have the remaining piece of text be at the top. So we're just going to select this, bring this down, have auto width work over here, and I just want to align this perfectly. And then we're going to go select the other half of this text and sort of have that aligned perfectly. Alright, let's just paste this back at the top, and now we're just aligning this perfectly at the center. Alright, this is our text box. We're just going to make this smaller. I do think right aligning this over here would lead to much better results in terms of visibility, so I'm just going to leave it here, and we're also going to change this font to be Playfair Display. So I'm just trying out a new effect today, and you're going to see how that works from the point of view of a person who's making this. Let's change this to italics, make the italics thicker, obviously. Alright, I feel like this truly adds that extra special element which we have been missing. Let's reduce the italics because this is definitely too thick. Alright, and this is now a nice piece of text. Sometimes there is a little bit of a readability issue which can be immediately handled by adding a drop shadow. We're going to change the color of this drop shadow from a black to a white, and a white drop shadow does wonders in terms of visibility for black if you're ever in that issue. Let's change this to be 0, and we're also going to change the y-axis value to be 0, and now we're going to increase the blur to be 24. This works much better in terms of readability. Like, this adds a level of extra white blur in the background just to make our dark text much more readable. The one last element that I do want to talk about which is missing from this UI is the logo. So we've just added this boilerplate name colored logo, but realistically any luxury brand would have a better logo, so we're just going to try to design that quickly today. Let's change this back to black, and we're going to try to make something that truly looks awesome. And I feel like this is where all of the rest of the tools that we've been ignoring for a little while, so we went from cursor to text tool and the last 4 options remain. This is where those options truly start to kick in. So I'm just adding these 2 lines which are going to be a part of my logo. I want to select these lines, make them smaller, bring them to the background, make them thicker obviously. Let's bring this up to 4, and then we're going to change them to have different colors. The colors that I'm using now are going to be the exact shade of pink that we have been using, and also we're going to use the exact black that we've been using. Right click, and now we're just going to right click on this V and bring this to the front, and now we have this logo which actually looks really nice. Let's just select this entire thing and right click, Control G to group this section, and now we have our logo ready with us. Alright, if this is a logo that we've made for our brand now and we want to reuse it across, now we're going to use the export tool to sort of get this logo in and out again. So let's just export this logo. I want to export this as an SVG so that it becomes scalable and the size can be changed without a lot of pixelation when we're reusing this logo once again. And now we have our downloaded file, so I'm just going to delete this group and get our SVG file which we have just now downloaded. Let's just go back over here, select the image tool and get the group that we've just now exported, and with that we have our logo which we can now move around and place anywhere we want, and it will become much easier to just position elements as well as add brand names. Now I want to just have this stay at the top just as a little bit of a mark of what we're building. Let's just leave it positioned here and we can change the size if we need to. Alright, so we've gotten our logo and I'm just going to place this over here. You can change its colors obviously if you need to, but I'm just happy with the way it looks. And with that, we've made our first entire luxury website UI. I also want to talk about a couple of tools that we didn't talk about. This is the path tool, and you can basically use it to draw these freeform curves and paths. And there's a bunch of tools, but they basically draw any illustrated vector shape that you'd want. But more on this in an advanced video. There is also the plugins tool where you can install a plugin from the plugins list or write a plugin URL, which is also another advanced topic that we'll cover in the advanced Penpot video. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we've not only covered the entire Penpot UI, all of the basic tools of Penpot to get you started building your very own UI UX design. You can also go over to the top, and now that we have our entire UI ready with us, we can start prototyping this. So we're just going to use the play button at the top, and this already lets us know to use the play button to run the prototype view. So let's just see what the prototype looks like. Check this out, you guys. This is our complete entire luxury UI design along with the world's easiest Penpot crash course. What more could you ask for? This looks awesome. And with that, we have successfully completed our very first UI design in Penpot. You can expand on this, make it an entire website, add it to your portfolio, and just get started on your journey with UI UX design using Penpot. This has been the world's easiest Penpot crash course. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd also want to see the complete entire Figma crash course where we also create a whole entire website from scratch, if you're just a beginner, that's present right here. If you're not familiar with what UI design is, here's the complete crash course in just 3 minutes. If you're not familiar with what UX design is, this is the complete crash course on UX design, the world's easiest one of course, in just 5 minutes. And I will see you in the next one.